Margaret Jane Moore, a PhD student at the University of Oxford under the supervision of Nell de Meyer, and she'll present us a Voxel-Lesion Symptom mapping study illustrating how right and left neglect are not anatomically homologous. Thank you, Margaret.
Hi. So as mentioned, my name is Margaret and I'm working on my PhD at the University of Oxford. Most of my research has to do with studying spatial attention from the cognitive neuropsychological perspective. And today I'm going to be talking about a project we have recently finished looking at the anatomy of neglect. So for those of you who aren't familiar with visuospatial neglect is a common neuropsychological syndrome characterized by consistently lateralized spatial attentional deficits. And although neglect is generally characterized as just a hemispatial deficit, there are also multiple behavioral phenotypes that you see in the clinical environment. And the two I'm going to focus on today is egocentric, which is self-centered neglect, and allocentric, which is object-centered. And this is an example of what this looks like on a classic neuropsychological test. So in this test, patients are asked to go through and cross off all complete hearts while ignoring the incomplete ones. And patients with egocentric neglect will go through, cross off all the hearts on one side, while patients with allocentric will cross off hearts throughout the whole search matrix, but they'll also make these consistently lateralized false positive errors, which you see highlighted in red. So although these two conditions do frequently co-occur, there's a lot of evidence suggesting they are actually doubly dissociated. And a lot of this evidence comes from looking at the brain. So previous research has done a really good job of characterizing the anatomy of left egocentric and allocentric neglect following right hemisphere lesions. And this is from a really nice meta-analysis done by Magda Czechblaks, which looked at 1,300 patients and found these really nice dissociated different correlates for egocentric versus allocentric neglect impairment within the right hemisphere. And this is quite a nice finding, but as you'll see, it's just within one hemisphere. And if you are familiar with clinical neglect at all, although you pretty much always say, oh, right neglect, right hemisphere damage, left neglect, it actually happens the other way too. So you have a good amount of patients with left hemisphere damage and right neglect, and the anatomy of those patients isn't nearly as well understood. So there's been a couple studies looking at the anatomy of neglect following left hemisphere lesions. This is one that comes from Karnarth. He looked at 11 patients with right egocentric neglect and found that the areas which were significantly associated with right egocentric neglect were kind of the anatomical homologues of the areas that had been previously found to be associated with spatial attentional in the processes in the opposite hemisphere. And this is, so they do make this big sweeping claim, then whatever's going on attentionally in the left hemisphere is pretty much the same as the right hemisphere, just not dominant. But I think you need a little bit more information to make this claim. First off, pretty low number of patients, only 11, I think, especially with given the really massive diversity in lesions which can cause neglect, you need a bigger sample to really be confident about this. And you actually need to do some quantitative comparisons between hemispheres to see what's going on comparatively and see if we can actually pull out differences between the two. And that leads us into the aims of this study. So purposes of this study is to identify the neurocorrelates of left and right egocentric and allocentric neglect in a representative sample of stroke survivors. And this is the VLSM component of this analysis. And then move on to the secondary aim, which is to determine whether right neglect is supported by left hemisphere homologues of regions which are critical for left lateralized neglect following right hemisphere damage, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I'll do my best to simplify that later on. So we did this in a massive sample of acute stroke patients. There were 499 people we recruited who all did the Oxford Cognitive Screen's Hearts Cancellation task in the acute phase following stroke, and also had available clinical neuroimaging, which I could use to make all these lesion masks. And we ended up with a nice number of patients in each group. So our minimum impairment group was 28 for both allocentric neglects, but within each of these comparisons, we also included these 283 neglect controls, which you'll see at the bottom row of this diagram, meaning that pretty much every analysis we ran had at least 300 patients in it, and we're looking at both sides of the brain. So on to VLSM. So VLSM stands for Voxel-Lesion Symptom Mapping, and it's a pretty common neuropsychological approach. The figure illustrates the general pipeline for this analysis. If you have any questions about exactly what we did, I can go into it in more detail. But we ran 4 separate VLSM analyses looking at the neurocorrelates independently of left egocentric, right egocentric, left allocentric, and right allocentric neglect, all run independently. And importantly, we did these groups based on behavioral grouping. So you fell in the left neglect group if you had left neglect, regardless of where your lesion was. So we're not grouping patients according to where their lesions is, we're grouping them according to their behavior, We did voxel-wise comparisons, minimum overlap of 10, so only looked at voxels with at least 10 lesions in them. Given that we binarized impairment, we used the non-parametric Liebermeister measure as our actual statistical test, use this non-neglect group as controls, and use Bonferroni corrections, which is worth pointing out because Bonferroni corrections are pretty widely regarded as being too conservative for VLSM, but we wanted to be as conservative as possible for this. So next state of the analysis is the Lasso bit. So Lasso stands for least absolute squared selection operator, which is pretty much a fancier way of doing stepwise linear regression. So in this kind of analysis, you throw in a bunch of covariates which could potentially explain an impairment. Use Lasso to select which ones you're actually interested in and then go from there. So in this study, what we did is any ROI defined based on a couple of atlases that actually contained significant voxels in the VLSM analysis was considered for a potential covariate. We used Lasso analysis to select which ones were actually explaining most of the variance. We evaluated the fit of these models by looking at how percentage damage to these areas actually predicted binarized neglect impairment versus a null model of just lesion volume. And then we did the core of this analysis, which is this hemisphere swap, in which we take the model which we made based off of the right hemisphere data, apply it to the left hemisphere data to try to see if the homologues actually predict impairment, and run some tests to see whether or not that's good. So first off, our VLSM results. This is a little small. I hope you can see it well. I'm going to do my best to point things out. So first off, I'm not going to talk very much about the results for left egocentric and left allocentric because these highlighted in blue agree really well with past literature. So it's a nice finding because it shows that our data is actually good. It's pulling out what it needs to pull out, but not super theoretically interesting at the moment. What is interesting, however, is neurocorrelates we get for right allocentric neglect, which is highlighted in red, right down here, and this falls in the anterior division of the parahippocampal gyrus within the left hemisphere. And this is quite nice because the parahippocampal gyrus is an area that's been traditionally associated with object level processing, particularly within the ventral visual stream. And so it conceptually makes sense. And this is the first study that's ever managed to find a neurocorrelate associated with right allocentric neglect. So this is a cool new finding. The other bit, which is really interesting, is the neurocorrelate we found for right egocentric neglect, which I think you should be able to see it, but it's this tiny little yellow dot right here, which is interesting. So it's in the parietal operculum cortex, and it's ipsilateral, which is really fascinating. So this is a right hemisphere correlate of right egocentric neglect. This isn't entirely new, so there's been a couple case studies that have found right neglect following right lesions, but it's never been done on this scale before. And within our sample, we had patients with both left and right lesions and right neglect, but the actual driving correlate the VLSM is pulling out is ipsilateral, which is really fascinating. So on to the Lasso analysis. So what we get while looking at egocentric neglect is we see that the left hemisphere homologues of the ROIs implicated in left egocentric neglect were not found to act as significant predictors of right egocentric neglect. What this means is whatever is going on in the left hemisphere is not the same as whatever is going on in the right hemisphere. And again, you see a nice support for that argument by seeing that the correlate underlying right neglect is actually ipsilateral. So that makes sense. But we see the opposite thing when we look at allocentric neglect. So the model which we built based off the right hemisphere data did actually significantly predict the impairment within the left hemisphere as well. So whatever's going on, object level processing seems to be analogous across hemispheres, but whatever's going on, self-centered processing seems to be completely different, which is interesting. So a couple quick things to run through. So first off, the identified neurocorrelates of left egocentric and allocentric neglect agree with previous literature. This is nice because it shows our data is doing what we actually wanted it to be doing. The study is the first to identify the neurocorrelates of right allocentric neglect. And again, conceptually makes sense. It's quite interesting because it can help guide people to know who might actually be having this problem. Right egocentric neglect was found to be most strongly predicted by ipsilateral damage centered within the right parietal operculum cortex, which is again quite a novel finding and is pretty important to consider in the context of this current theories of hemisphere dominance and spatial attention. So traditionally, the right hemisphere attends to both sides of space, the left hemisphere just attends to contralesional space, which is why you're supposed to get neglect just after right hemisphere damage. But we can see that doesn't necessarily fit the damage, the description. You can get right neglect following both left and right lesions, and we need a bit of research to understand why that's actually happening. I think the core big thing to take away from this is that right egocentric neglect cannot accurately conceptualize as resulting from damage to left hemisphere homologues. Whatever's going on in the other hemisphere is different, and it's really important to acknowledge this when doing research with different kinds of neglect. important takeaway, if I could take one thing away, is that neglect is really, really complicated. It's not just right hemisphere damage, left neglect. And if you're going to do any research involving neglect, you really need to split it apart into these separate behavioral groups. So other research has shown they're dissociated, they follow different recovery trajectories, they're differentially associated with long-term functional outcomes. There's really are a lot of differences between these neglect subtypes. And so it doesn't make sense just to say all patients with neglect. If you want to do neglect research, break it down into different groups and then go from there. And then again, that this idea of right neglect just being an anatomical homologue of left neglect isn't correct. Something different is going on there. I think from what we've seen, it's probably best to think about right neglect as kind of a common symptom of multiple underlying causes rather than this clean unitary syndrome. So quick thanks to everyone who helped out with this. So these are my two co-authors, and Nayla's my supervisor, my lab, and then the people who give me money to do research. So thank you to them. You can look me up on Twitter if you're interested, hunt down my lab website. And also, because I'm a big fan of open science, pretty much all the data for this study is openly available. I think all the code is there, all the lesion voxel significant maps, all that stuff is openly available. And this manuscript is under review, but hopefully it will be out in the world pretty soon. Great, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Margaret. Good luck for the revisions of the paper, and thank you from the whole community for sharing your data and your code, because it's an impressive data set. If I can start off with a question, again, biased by my language research, do you think language lateralization can play a role at all in how attention gets specialized on the left versus the right hemisphere?
Yeah. So the paper I talked about, the second one I talked about from Karnarth, their idea is that spatial attention in the left hemisphere is held by these like relics of old spatial attention areas that are now taken over by language. And so one of his ideas is that we don't actually it's not dominant in the left hemisphere because those areas have been taken over by language. So that would mean that the side language is on does actually affect which side of the brain affects what's paying attention to where. But I'm not entirely sure. That is their idea.
And in your sample, you don't have enough, like you don't have data on the language lateralization, and you don't have enough left-handed to try to put it as a covariate?
We don't have data on language lateralization, but we do have like standard neuropsychological language screening assessments. So that could be put in at some point in time.
That would be very interesting. I don't know, we have like, I think 1 minute if all the speakers want to come back on screen, if anyone has any last questions. If they come right when we stop, we will be able to send them to you if they come in the chat or in the Q&A. But yeah, otherwise I'm gonna just thank you very much for the 3 brilliant talks, extremely interesting. Do motion if you have questions. Yeah.
Hi. So yes, fantastic talks, everyone. Margaret, I had a question regarding the neglect syndrome that we were talking about. Has their work been done on other modalities of recordings, such as EEG, MEG, stuff like that as well? And what change have they seen? Is it changes on the ERPs, for example, that are kind of in line with the old research on neglect that was done?
So I think it's quite tricky to do any kind of functional imaging with neglect because a lot of neglect recovers within the first 10 days following stroke, and it's really difficult to get access to these patients right then. And a lot of these patients are old people who can't go in scanners, can't focus for long enough, have other stroke deficits. So I don't think a lot of nice neglect imaging work has been done, but there has definitely been some functional, specifically fMRI, but I'm not all that familiar with it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, maybe just one last following this. Do you think that maybe the left cases are sort of neglected because they have predominantly language deficits? So we just neuropsychologically we focus on those deficits instead of investigating the visuospatial.
Yep. So I've actually done a lot of work on how neglect is assessed in a clinical environment, and there's huge expectation biases in people who have neglect following left hemisphere lesions because you traditionally wouldn't expect that. And so even if the neglect is severe and behaviorally apparent, it doesn't get diagnosed observationally because that's not what clinicians are expecting to see. So another reason why neuropsychological assessment is really important because it can keep us from being biased humans.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was a great way to start the morning here on the East Coast. And we are going to have now 10 minutes of break.